is our studio, this is our store.
You're an architect turned furniture designer, and I wonder if that's natural progression for somebody who's been designing buildings on the outside to now thinking about the beauty of those buildings on the inside.
Well, I would say it's intrinsic to architecture. When you think of spaces, quite naturally you think of the objects within the space. You think of how the people within those spaces will use those objects.
How much of the architect remains in you?
I still think of myself largely as an architect because that's what I trained in. Furniture design was more of a vocation that came through serendipity and through being in Lamu for a building project actually, and working with the local carpenters manufacturing doors and windows. And then I started to rack my brain and think, how could we use some of the motifs, some of the lattice work, some of the carving? How do we apply the same craftsmanship in furniture?
You've often said that you are inspired by Swahili aesthetics, and you even use the words a vernacular tone. Could you explain to me what you mean by that?
I actually tend to think about architecture or design basically as a language. For me, it was really an interrogation into finding a local language, a local way of speaking design-wise. I think the analogy of for me, language and design goes hand in hand.
So what is the Swahili language in a building, and how would it differ from the Italian language in a building?
So I think this now goes back to history. If you think about how the Swahili towns came to be through contact with the Omanis, the Indians, the Yemenis, and the Bantu tribes that lived along the coast. So you had design elements that came from the Arab world, the Indian world, but then you had certain constraints material-wise that created a hybrid between certain intentions and certain materials.
Let's talk about the business. You're an architect, but essentially you're a business owner, you're an entrepreneur. And in order for you to run a successful business, it's making people understand what you do technically and artistically. Has it been an easy or difficult journey?
I would say I've been very lucky that I started this business in this very remote island in the age of connectivity. When we actually started this business, we didn't have a store. The business was predominantly online. I would have faced very difficult challenges had it not been for the advent of the internet, social media. So I've been very lucky in that regard. But that being said, it is still a challenge convincing people that not everything is driven by price. There is value in knowing where your things are made. There is value in having a sense of pride with things that you buy. There is value in aesthetics. It's not just about the numbers. Sometimes it's beyond the numbers. And if you have a really good piece of furniture that you can hand down from one generation to another generation, I think there is a lot of value, like sentimental value, in having heirloom pieces.
They often say that the African middle class is aspirational and global in those aspirations. So how have people responded to you as a designer?
Right now, we're seeing an interest from people in regards to the narrative of what they're using, where it's produced, where it was sourced. That, I think, has created demand into objects that are narrative-driven.
What do you mean by that? So people will buy a piece from you because it has a story, because it has a history.
Yeah, it has a history, it has a story, it's produced in a very specific way that honors the craftsmanship of a certain region. And I think people want to hear that. They want to know more about their products. There's still this passive consumerism, but people are more conscious about where they're spending their money.
And when they spend their money, how do they quantify that? Because I think as an architect, you can measure the input and the output. So you design a building and it costs $500,000 US. But then you add an extra $500,000 US for the artistic value you bring as an architect. How do you justify that? How do you explain that?
Well, I think in terms of the artistic value, the quality of the space, that is something that the user may not understand when you're projecting it as a visualization. But if you think of a restaurant, for example, why would you eat in a restaurant that's well lit, that's atmospheric? Yes, instead of like having a meal with very aggressive lighting,
At a kiosk.
at a kiosk with no ventilation. There is that quality, there is that extra enjoyment that people derive from well-designed spaces, and that can be quantified in sort of monetary terms, because you can see that people will use a space better when they're more comfortable within that space. So it's not just about flashy design. It's about how a space makes you feel, and that's the quality of the space. So it's when you have a certain, like if you have this bench in your home, how does that make you feel, knowing it was made in Lamu, knowing it was made by local craftsmen, knowing that every piece of it was handmade, and also like when you sit on it, and maybe as a young Kenyan, maybe it gives you a sense of pride, it gives you a sense of connection to your country. So I think those are all elements that can be quantified because they are real and you do feel them.